for the very first session of this conference, centered around the theme Desire, Consciousness and Creativity, to be chaired by Professor Sukrita Kumar, Professor, Department of English, Zakir Hussain College. She is a famous poet. Yes, ma'am is a retired professor. Yeah, sorry. She is a famous poet, author, translator, and retired professor, Department of English, Zakir Hussain College. A recipient of numerous fellowships and residencies, she held the Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at the University of Delhi. Currently, she is the guest editor of Indian Literature and co-editor of the Writer in Context series published by Routledge, UK. In 2023, she was awarded the Rabindranath Tagore Award for Literature. Yeah.
What I'm saying is if you can maybe cut down on the...
Oh, that's
details.
Sure.
You don't have time.
Right. Yes. Okay, so we can move on with the panel. So we have on our panel Professor Sudeep Patra and Professor Swati Padma. Professor Sudeep
Recording
Patra
in progress.
Is an associate professor at OP Jindal Global University, and Professor Swati Padma is professor and principal at Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. So I'll request Professor Sudeep Patra, maybe. Yeah. I also hand over the proceedings now, Chair. Now, ma'am will be.
I really don't think I have much of a role to play because, except for perhaps connecting the loose threads, or if they are not loose, make them loose threads. Because I think we need to have, as I was just saying, we need to have some chaos. Only then there would be creativity. Otherwise, too much of discipline doesn't work with me. And I would not like you to discipline me. However, I do feel that the subject that you've given us, as a panel, is extremely exciting because it says desire, consciousness, and creativity, and one does not exist without the other. But yes, the strings between them are very tenuous, very tenuous. Because the moment you want to get into creativity, sometimes for false reasons, that's where there is a problem. Because if you want to pretend to be creative, you think you are creative, every one of us is creative, but that subconscious has to be activated, right? It has to come to the surface. And for that you require consciousness, and for consciousness to be woken up, you do require somewhere a trigger. And the trigger may be lying in the zone of desire, right? So it's all linked, and yet each gets cancelled when you go on to the next one. And so desire has to sleep, once again, the moment you get into consciousness, awakening of the consciousness. And once the awakening of the consciousness happens, that's when you don't know, it's a sense of adventure. All poets, all creativity comes out of a certain kind of, hard work and discipline, and yet chaos, as I said. So that consciousness needs to have a sense of wonder and what I call phenomenal consciousness, right? Because everything, you have to become a child all the time. You have to remain a child in one sense all the time. Because it's only the child who may have tasted and has been in her sense of wonder about life experience. We say to the child, this is a spoon, it is for utility purposes, eat with it. But for the child, that shine of the spoon and the shape of the spoon makes it look like a toy, right? And that is the joy that we need to experience with sense of wonder about every experience that one has in life. So that phenomenal consciousness, I think, once it gets awakened in one, normally the civilizational forces are beating you to sleep, So that consciousness does, in fact, it stops functioning. And you are a deadened, who was it? Samuel Beckett, my favorite writer, he would say, habit is a deadener, And you deaden with that. Because out of habit, if you keep doing certain things, you are deadened. But the idea is if there is a super alertness of a certain kind, attention without feeling the burden of having to be attentive, Just naturally that awareness comes. I think it was J. Krishnamurti who talks about attention in a particular way. And that attention, that quality of attention, if you get at that, then even the blade of grass is going to sing to us. And that singing that the blade of grass is doing is actually the consciousness awakened. And the song is being produced there. So it's the sounds that run into, and I just read one or two little things here, which are just two-liners, right? I'm sorry, but this is written by me. I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the me. I don't think it's me of a small s who writes this. Because the journey of creativity is from the small s self to the larger self, which unites us all, and it would be very arrogant to say it is me, my writing. No, it's something else that happens, and we keep trying to decipher it. However, no more of talk about it. These are series of little things that I've done, little writings, which I'm calling poemlets, right? And why poemlets? Because I do feel that this micro should contain within itself the macro, right? So I'm just writing these days, one after the other, without going into the discipline of haiku. It's not haiku, and yet I'll just read 2-3 of them so that you get a feel of it, and we move on into the next, speaker's presentation. These are series on silence. Silence is the prime meridian. All time starts from there. Silence is a vertical line that runs through the spine. All energy rises from there. Silence is the movement between silence is the movement between one note and the next. All sound is impregnated within. Silence is the baby suckling her mother's breast. All cries of hunger lie drowned. So, we create words if only to create silence. And so, the next kind of silence that you will hear is from the next speaker.
Thank you very much. I mean, it goes beyond words. Again, going back to words is difficult. But yes, so I'm Sudeep, and I'm also joined by Professor Hussain, my dear friend, and we both come from Jindal Global University, and we basically work very much in chaos, complexity, and quantum. So that is our area, and we would rather like to extend that work into cognitive science, decision science, and social sciences. So that is where our works lie. Later on, if time permits, I will talk a bit about our center. But right now, I go back to the main topic. That is where I'm involved in, and this particular work is often called as quantum-like framework. It is a fascinating interface between philosophy and mathematical modeling of quantum science, quantum information theory more particularly, and human mind, one may say, or mind in general. I mean, we don't know, mind can be thought in a more general sense, and then relating that to social sciences, etc. Now, let me start from the so-called Newtonian paradigm. Though I always find, and I discuss this with my students also, that Sir Isaac Newton himself was very interesting. He was not like a reductionist and deterministic, but his followers were more Newtonian than himself. Like Laplace and others. So we know this kind of European kind of view, Western view, which reigned the world for a long period of time, this determinist and linear thinking, objective realism as it is called. So the reality is outside you, and as a scientist or as a researcher, your main point is basically to record passively what is going on outside. But again, from 1920s onwards, or even earlier to that, suddenly it goes millennia in our civilization. I'm mainly talking about so-called modern science. In 1920s onwards, there was certainly outbreak or awareness coming up that this cannot be the case. we have to move beyond this. We have to move beyond objective realism and determinism, linearity, and so on. And the main perspective which really enlightened this was quantum physics. There's no doubt about that. And quantum physics came out of necessity in some sense, because there were many experiments which were coming up at that time, which could not be explained at all by coming up with this so-called Newtonian frame. Mainly in optics, radiation theory, and so on and so on, certainly atomic, subatomic particles. So quantum physics came up with its own framework, but then suddenly later on, it delved very deep into philosophy also, along with the mathematical and physics framework. So much so that the founders of quantum physics at that time, Niels Bohr, for example, and certainly Max Born and Schrödinger and others, certainly Pauli, another Russian genius. So they started thinking that the philosophical principles which are coming up from quantum science, that can be not only restricted to physical world or physical system, but they have a more universal character. Now there's a very interesting book which has come up last 2-3 years back. The name is a bit provocative, Quantum International Relations. It is from Oxford University Press, and there's a very interesting group at Ohio State University where I will be traveling next year. And they have a very interesting group where they are political scientists, but they are basically alluring to some of the philosophical principles which were coming up from quantum science, and to see that whether we can learn something for social systems. So in that particular book, the first chapter or second chapter, I think, goes back into this very interesting history of conversations between scientists and philosophers and cognitive scientists at their time. For example, very interesting, perhaps many of you know that Pauli, one quantum founder, he had a long conversation with Carl Jung, and out of their conversation came up very interesting worldviews. In 2015, a new book has come up, Pauli-Jung conjecture, which talks about a different kind of a world which goes beyond binary. We heard a lot about this kind of binaries and going beyond binaries, and certainly going back to ancient civilizations and wisdom. That is always the case, but that was also very much within their conversation. Now, therefore, this was happening for a long period of time, and then from late 1990s and early 2000, people started thinking that whether we can use certain principles and mathematical structures also from this evolving debate and relate that to cognitive science. Because you see, unfortunately, cognitive science at that time was also very much dominated by this linear and determinist thinking. But it goes without saying that human mind transcends all that. So it is always transcending binaries, it is always creative, it is genuinely creative. So is it at all possible to come up with some scientific framework to kind of be compatible with that or to capture that? So that was how quantum-like framework came up. But then certainly interesting philosophical underpinnings were emerging. And I would like to talk about some points here. The first point which came out from all of this philosophical interaction was that an entangled and non-local world. Now, certainly entanglement and non-locality, I'm not using it as a physical perspective, so it is much more than that. So you see, if we go back to the earlier Western philosophy of science, the main point was about separability. The main point was about localizability. It's often called as a locality principle. So every particular system has its own kind of space in space and time, and that can be differentiated from another system, and then you build up your interactions, theory of interactions based on that. But what quantum physics actually showed was that perhaps this is not the right way to think about the non-local universe. The universe itself is non-local, which means that we have to go beyond the thinking of physical space-time. Now, certainly this is a big shock. So much we know that even greats like Albert Einstein could not digest this, and he had a long fight with not only Niels Bohr, but also he had a very interesting conversation with Rabindranath Tagore. and actually he met Tagore twice or thrice. But it seems that they were respectful of each other, but Tagore's view of Eastern philosophies was not totally understood by Einstein. So Tagore was always trying to convince that you cannot keep consciousness, you cannot keep human or mind out of the equation. It is not simply possible. So the world is not objective and realist in that sense. Now, how that can be done, how matter and mind and how matter and consciousness can be interconnected in a scientific manner, that was not very well thought of that time. But very recently, I will say that some of our own works and some of the works which are happening in neuroscience, which is exactly trying to do the same. For example, if I take the reference of Donald Hoffman, a very important neuroscientist who came to our center also for an interesting session. So his point of view and his collaborators' point of view is that we need to think about consciousness from the different way. Earlier it was thought that consciousness is somehow epiphenomenon in Western thinking, or it is a kind of emergent from matter. But that is really not taking us far. So we need to rather think that consciousness is fundamental. We need to think that consciousness is the only thing through which we are observing whatever matter is. So taking the other route, taking the opposite route. Now certainly this is a very difficult route to take because modern science has been biased so much by Cartesian duality and this kind of binariness that a very large shift has to come. But I'm hopeful that that is happening. Slowly and steadily it is happening. For example, some of my collaborators, one is certainly very well-known complexity scientist, Professor Stuart Kaufman. So Stuart and I have been working on quite a few projects, and there we are proposing that if we really want to think about this creativity, then we have to come out of this Cartesian duality and objective realism. The second point I would like to talk about is certainly another point of uncertainty. Now you see that earlier uncertainty, even today, if we go back to economics, for example, uncertainty is always thought in a very typical, epistemic way. Epistemic means that the world is there, the world has only one trajectory, but since I am ignorant of that, therefore I can work with some probability distributions. And those probability distributions are just based on our ignorance. But there is another kind of uncertainty, which was historically first shown by quantum but need not to be tied up to quantum, and that is the ontological uncertainty. And ontological uncertainty means that world is uncertain. You don't need to tame that. You cannot tame that. As our chair very rightly said, that it cannot be disciplined. Rather, that's completely an idiotic thinking. So it cannot be done. So it is inherently creative, it is inherently uncertain. Rather, we need to adjust to that, we need to celebrate that, we need to love that, embrace that. And that particular thinking was certainly historically kind of proposed philosophically by quantum science. Though certainly I will say that there are many interpretations of quantum science, people always try to move away from that and try to relate that again back to determinism, but we cannot totally wish away that. Now, why do I bring this up? Because recently, very recently, in social sciences and particularly in economics, this idea of ontological uncertainty has been slowly coming up. Because earlier economics was very much biased by this Bayesian and deterministic worldview, that there is only one trajectory of the world and you just have to probabilistically model that. But now the area, say for example, Sharik and I work in, Sharik More, is complexity science. And complexity science basically has this idea that we have to really embrace and adjust according to this uncertainty. And that is also coming in to policy making nowadays. So there is a particular new concept which has come in, which is called as decision making under deep uncertainty. And deep uncertainty here means this ontological uncertainty rather than epistemic. So that is one point. And then certainly creativity. Now that is a very, very kind of fascinating point. We know that nothing more than art that can show us creativity. I myself very, very passionate about poetry and others. Now I will get back to poetry, but before that, let me bring in some very interesting works which are happening in hardcore physics, which actually talks about creativity. Now this is shocking because earlier there was no place for creativity. If you go back to Newtonian science or even standard scientific frameworks, there is always this idea that everything is determined, everything is somewhere there already. Scientists use this word called as possibility space or configuration space, so that is already fixed. So maybe you do not know that and therefore you come up with different kind of clever modeling. But very recently a new view has come up, and where again, as I mentioned, Stuart Kaufman and his collaborators are working. This view is often called as biocosmology view. Now biocosmology view says that no, it is not like that. The so-called possibility space that you are talking about or configuration space that you are talking about, that itself is evolving, that is not fixed. So if that itself is evolving, then you cannot model that with the help of standard mathematical apparatus, for example, often called as configuration space modeling. That brings in genuine creativity. Genuine creativity means that there is novelty. There is, as say in art, we know that. And this novelty is like a real physical feature. So it is not simply like we are thinking like that, but every time an information is created, that information is a new thing which is being created. That is the novelty thing, and that is this framework is coming up. Now then, why I bring poetry up, now that is a fascinating story. Because you see that very recently the area that I work in, quantum-like framework, that has gone into literature. Now, because the quantum-like framework always wants to understand human decision-making or human mind in some sense. And certainly understanding literature or understanding poetry, I don't know whether it is possible to understand poetry or realize poetry. So that is much more kind of quantum-like framework has got into that. So what they're trying to say is that, when a person is reading a poem or when we try to realize poetry, this feeling of ambiguity, the feeling of uncertainty, not in a negative sense, but uncertainty in a creative sense, that is really happening. That is a real feature. And is it possible to come up with a kind of a framework which describes this uncertainty and ambiguity? Now, in quantum information theory, there is something called a superposition principle. So superposition principle means that it is a kind of superposition between all kind of odds, between all kind of potential. Say for example, if I say that there are two possibilities, 0 and 1, whatever 0 and 1 may mean, so you can have a state which is a superposition of 0 and 1 rather than only 0 or only 1. Another very interesting point is that this superposition goes beyond probabilities. It is not probability mixture. It is just a kind of linear superposition. Rather, the coefficients are complex numbers. I don't want to be technical, but that is it. So whether that kind of a principle can illuminate more about how human mind realizes any kind of art form or any kind of literature, any kind of poetry. And as far as I know that many works are happening in that direction. In Japan, for example, I know some of my collaborators are working in that. So poetry and science, there's a kind of like an inherent relation which is coming up more and more. I would also like to mention another thing, that artificial intelligence has been talked about. But I find always that there is a debate to be skeptical about that. This goes back to Roger Penrose also. So Roger Penrose, though Roger Penrose is very much physicalist and reductionist, but one point he makes is very interesting. He says that when you see that ultimately human mind or mind in general cannot be reduced to computation. So there is something happening which may still be physical according to him, but which is going beyond computation. Now, if that happens, then certainly, at least as of now, what by we mean AI cannot capture that creativity. It is beyond that, because now AI is still algorithmic. So, is it possible that human mind is non-algorithmic? and goes beyond that, that is something which has to be thought about. And I think that these frameworks, quantum-like framework, etc., which are developing, are hinting towards that particular direction. So then certainly I would like to end on, or say just have a couple of reflection on the new work that I am doing with my very senior collaborator, and we have been writing books, etc. Professor Patra Ghosh. Professor Patra Ghosh is a very renowned scientist in our country. He has been a student of Satyam Bose, and whenever I go to him, I learn a lot about the conversations between Bose and Einstein. Partha Ghosh has a very interesting idea, and we are developing on that, on the interaction between Eastern philosophical traditions and quantum foundations. And that comes from Jain tradition. So this particular paper that we are developing, it is often, this tradition is known as Sadvada or Anekantavada, which Anekantavada, which Professor Thakur has been working for a long period of time. Now, we are basing our argument on the logical structure of this, the mathematical structure. And there the interesting thing is, as certainly we have learned in the morning, that going beyond any kind of binaries, going beyond any kind of extremes. So there the point is that either or is not the only two truth values or propositions. There can be another truth value or proposition which is equally valid, and that is avakyam, that is unmanifest. So unmanifest is on the same footing as, say, either or not. So if you consider these three positions which are equally valid, truth values for propositions, then a new logical framework can be built based on that. It's often called as Saptabhanga Naya or something like that. We have mentioned that. And based on that logical framework, it is very exciting to see that that can enlighten various so-called paradoxes in quantum physics which had still not been resolved. Because whenever you try to resolve quantum physical paradoxes from a binary and linear and deterministic view, it simply evades that. And then, a lot of quarrels, and we know it is going on for 100 years. So we are hopeful that that kind of illumination might happen. Therefore, going beyond binaries is one thing which we can learn a lot from Eastern philosophical traditions. Then certainly, okay, just about 1 minute. So finally, I would say that at our center then, let me get back to our center. Our center, as Shadi mentioned, it is known as Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy. And there our main point is to see that whether we can draw inference from the scientific and spiritual traditions and try to see that whether public policy can be based on those kind of principles. Now, this is a very, very kind of like an ambitious project, I know, because unfortunately public policy has been unfairly dominated by neoclassical view. So it is all about deterministic, selfish, utilitarian views and all that. But that is not the way how world works. World is much more creative in all sense, good, bad, ugly and all sense. So perhaps these new kind of principles which are coming out from this philosophical thinking, that might give certain interesting insights. We have come up with different books, etc., etc. So I will welcome all of you to come to our center and to join hands together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is how science and arts and so on, this binary in itself is exploding by and by. And it's not as if it's something new, but I think it is surfacing now in a better way. And I think we need to validate that as much as it's possible. Because here is a quantum physicist who is actually interested in poetry and ambiguity. And not going in for the binaries and yet, reconciliation of Capra. In fact, his previous experience of mathematical theories and diagrams, he had to throw them asunder to be able to listen to the Ananda or see the Ananda that he experienced. So here you are, the so-called very dignified scientist is also, Einstein did that all the time, even if he questioned. However, we want the right language at the right time of knowledge making. The construction of knowledge starts not at your level, Of course, you have achieved it. But the point is that it starts right at the nursery level. You know, I think it is therefore for us educationists, and we have a prominent educationist out here, and I believe that you are in a position to inject this new sensibility at a very primary level, and only then it can grow into understanding that we cannot understand, right? Thank
also
you.
the dialogue between Krishnamurti and Devi.
Yes, so prominent, yeah. So, should we move on to Swati? Right.
All I can say is first and foremost, wow. And when you have a chair like Sukrita ji, for whom I have such utmost reverence, I'm pretty much feeling tongue-tied, which for a principal to say that, you can imagine how I'm feeling right now. So I want to say that I'm feeling a bit of a misfit here because my area of research really is agitationalist theatre, propagandist theatre. That's the area that I have worked on for a very, very long time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before I move on to the presentation. Don't look at the title at all, it's completely misleading. I knew you'd look at it the moment I say don't look at it. Anyway, that's human reaction. That's human reaction. I knew you'd do that. So anyway, what I wanted to say about myself was that I grew up in a traditional Hindu family where, of course, Madhuji, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were constantly being told and retold in various ways. So by the time I was in my teens, I had read various versions of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but I found something emerging within myself, which is that somehow I got drawn to the not very traditional versions of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. As I grew older, I discovered this wonderful writer called Kiran Nagarkar, and I found that I loved bedtime story because of the twist that he gave. Shashi Thakur has also done that in the great Indian novel. When it comes to the Ramayana, I was always drawn to this three Ramayana. So why am I telling you this little bit about myself? Only for you to understand where my interest in the kind of theatre research that I've done arises from. And I'll borrow something from you, Sukrita ji. You talked about the journey of the small s. So I'll say the journey of the small s, Swati, to the journey of the big S, which is society, right? So for me, performance arts, and I'm now going to read, the relationship between art, performance, and consciousness can be explored through certain ideas. One of them being performance art, which is a live art that can challenge conventional social mores and artistic values. It can tap into our basic instincts, such as our need for human interaction, and can force us to think about uncomfortable issues. Performance art can also be a way to express ideas, feelings, and opinions. Now, we've talked so much about through the morning, we've talked a lot about poetry. I'm trying to be a poet these days. I don't know if I'm succeeding, but I'm trying definitely. No, not yet. Not yet, I'll tell you. So, I have noticed one thing as a literature person, as an Inglit person. Traditionally, drama has always been given a very step-sisterly treatment. It's always been considered the lowest of arts. And I have always wondered why. Because in fact, it is the most potent of arts, in my opinion. So the question that arises is, what is the significance of drama? The fact is that drama is the one genre that helps to build a collective spirit, or should I say that it helps to build a community. If I extend the meaning of drama to a meta-theatrical, or should I say beyond the scripted text, and look at those, we were talking in the morning about everyday situations, that's what Professor Joshi told us about. So if we look at those everyday situations that have all the paraphernalia, and I'm using a semiotic term here, all the paraphernalia of drama, say for example the kind of mass worship that we have at Jagarans, or at Durga Puja, I'm a Bengali, okay, or at kirtans, or the Friday prayers at the mosque, we will realize the potential that drama has. It joins people together in a shared act and a shared belief, and thus it promotes shared sentiments. It can certainly arouse dormant emotions as people in a gathering, and I'm talking in a post-pandemic world, are contagious in more than one sense. Now you can go on to the first slide. Anyone who's been to the Wagah border will know what I mean, because at the Wagah border, one is compelled to be either awestruck or vastly entertained by the grand theatrical spectacle that one sees there. And very quickly, I'd like you to move through the 4 slides, and I'd like everybody to have a look at the slides to understand what I mean. Look at the costume, look at the eye movement, look at the body movement. If this is not theatre, I don't know what it is. If this is not theatre that is being staged to arouse emotions, patriotic emotions, I don't know what theatre is. Yes, right, you can stop there. So every evening at the India-Pakistan border stations at Wagah and Hussainiwala, the gates at the border are closed for the day with a retreat ceremony called the lowering of flags. I'm sure many of you have witnessed this. I still haven't. Performed by the Border Security Force of India and the Pakistan Rangers, the lowering of flags is a choreographed drill with slogan chanting, speed marches, high kicks, and foot stampings. Anybody who's been in theatre will understand body movement, vocal usage and all of that, and will be able to see that in what we see at the Wagah border. This state-organized performance through a public spectacle is also an arena for staging political conflicts between the two countries. Through their bodily choreographies, the soldiers evince the tensions between India and Pakistan caused by frequent battles over territorial intrusions and military infiltrations. By mobilizing theorizations of body narratives, hypermasculinity and nationalism, the soldiers play out their aggressions and employ the drill not only as a substitute for cross-border battles and military interventions, but as embodiments of the nation and protectors of the motherland. No matter what be one's reaction, the fact remains that one can't miss the drama or the theatrical spectacle of it all, a drama that is a reminder of the continuation of conflict between two regimes of power. For the ceremony suggests that performance may well be a continuation of war and conflict by other means. Now, drama, especially of the agitationalist kind, which, as I've just told you, by nature, जब मैं छोटी थी, नाटक में बहुत हिस्सा लेती थी. And my family would always say, so even when I was genuinely speaking with passion, they would say, "Se to sirf nautanki karna aata hai." So the word nautanki really was given such a terrible, that's what I mean, that drama, nautanki has always been looked down upon, even in the way we use it in our colloquial phrase, a phraseology. Anyway, so drama, especially of the agitationalist kind, and I will give you examples from these, is my area of research interest, and has played a dramatic role, and I mean that both as an adjective and as a genre, in almost every continent or country, as even a casual glance at world events and conflictual situations in these countries can confirm. To mention a few, the tremendous power of street theatre in the overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines. In fact, it is apt that in the Philippines there is a film fest called Agitprop. Again, the activists of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia found agitprop theatre a useful tool in mobilizing the people into action. The next slide, please. These are flags used by them. Next slide. This is theatre during the time of the Velvet Revolution. And this is Estonian singing during the Velvet Revolution. So look at the tools. We're talking about art forms and we're talking about spirituality, but I'm talking about social consciousness. I'm saying that we're still using art forms, but look at what we are doing with it. How powerful the art form is. We talked about how art forms are really powerful and we require it if we want to remain human. I agree with that. The resistance theatre in South Korea, especially against the Japanese invasion, called Madang, which is the South Korean version of agitational street theatre, based on traditional folk drama and Western agitprop, and I'm now quoting from a very famous anthropologist called Eugene Van Irwin. The word agitational should be taken quite literally in this context. Many Madang performances succeed in getting the audience in such a state of ecstatic frenzy that they are spontaneously transformed from spectators into slogan-chanting political demonstrators. I love the use of his word transformed, because I think that is what art does. It transforms you. Many mass demonstrations were initiated or animated by Madang performances. You could please move to the next 3 slides. These are masks used by them, acrobatics, dance and rhythm. No, that's it, right. And song and dance in Madang theatre. In Australia, street performances in the mid-70s with a strongly political content that usually voiced the despair of tribal cultures found an emotionally charged audience. The techniques of agitprop groups were emulated by the Teatro Campesino, next slide please, the first of the Chicano theaters in the United States, which was founded in California as a part of the Farm Workers Union campaign for recognition in the mid-1960s. Black theatre in Africa and America, as for example Matsemala Manaka's group Soikwa's performance of Pula, relies largely on agitprop means in theatre to arouse the sympathy of spectators. You can move on to the next slides. Agitprop troops have been used by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. All over, that's 2 more slides please. So get back, yes. So Jane Fonda also, traveled with an agitprop theatre group. You would have, at least some of you belonging to my generation would have heard of Jane Fonda, if not the Generation Z sitting here. So anyway, all over India, street theatre using agitprop techniques is hugely popular, and such theatre exponents as Badal Sarkar, you can move on to the next slide, and Safdar Hashmi are almost household names in the north, right? Of course, agitational and propagandist theatre, or agitprop theatre as it is called, is used for more than the projection of resistance, conflict, hostility, etc. In some instances, agitprop techniques are used for other purposes. As for example, agitprop has remained a consistent part of the Chinese government's education program in rural areas. So theatre as education is something that I cannot talk about right now because I would need an entire 2 hours to talk about it, but that is my favorite hobby horse, and I wish that teachers would across disciplines would understand how effective theatre is as a tool. When you enter into a classroom, I wonder if academics realize that is your theatre space. The sacred space and the profane space, I don't want to tell the students that, but the sacred space of where the teacher is standing and performing, and if she doesn't perform well, the angst that she feels, the audience reaction.
Think the students don't perform it?
They perform a lot, of course, but sometimes the students forget that they can be seen. So for example, when they're surreptitiously looking at their mobile phones to check what the time is for their Rajma Chawal, they don't realize that they're actually being looked at by the teacher, so that it's a two-way process always, because unlike in the auditorium, the lights are not dimmed. Okay, so these examples I think are adequate evidence of the power of a genre like drama. I began with the premise that a live art form that can challenge conventional social mores and artistic values, performance art can tap into our basic instincts such as our need for human interaction and can force us to think about uncomfortable issues. Performance art can also be a way to express ideas, feelings and opinions, and very, very briefly, I hope I've been able to do that, but Sukrita ma'am, you will allow me the liberty. I'll take 1 minute more. I have a book of poems that is coming out very soon. It's called Forever Yours and Other Poems, and I want to read one poem from that. It's called Eternal Companion, and why I'm reading it is because when Sukrita ma'am spoke about silence, this resonated with me. It's called Eternal Companion. The two of us are marooned on an island called silence. We each have a companion called emptiness. Your emptiness speaks to my emptiness. We hear their somber voices talking about another time, a time consumed by laughter, a time fraught with activity, a time when time passed quickly. And then we hear their voices choke, fall silent, for now there is only and only a sea of nothingness in the center of which we are stranded. You, me, emptiness. Thank you.
Actually, the last bit, the poem, is actually challenging your earlier position. And I would say that in terms of English professors and scholars, that's where we get stuck because, you know, Swati, in the context of theatre, if you look at our indigenous Indian theatre traditions, you find that there isn't any dichotomy or binary between poetry and theatre. And even today, if you look at the oral traditions, and if you go into Tamasha, or if you go into anywhere in the country, to the oral traditions and also the indigenous patterns of theatre, there'll be dance, there'll be also paintings, you know, Chitrakatha and all of that. So I think our minds, because we are all anglicized in the educational pattern, we teach that way, genres of literature, you know, and then we do that. And so there is a need to come back to that, even in the English that we have. That is why, you know, it was a very political thrust with which we worked to say that prescribe your own theatre, your own poetry, and then all this gets exploded, right? So do we have another speaker? No. So I would like to also retaliate, Swati, with another poem, and that is because you triggered off in me my poem on Vaga, right? So this is so Vaga border. So this is not a small one, this is from another book actually, but I'm going to read that if only to sort of demonstrate how Vaga also to me was theatre. At Vaga. At Vaga, I love you the most. The border marked by the spectacle of stomping army boots, shining medals, beating their chests into the rising and setting sun, the day becoming night and the night day, when the guards on both sides exchange bang, bang. I love you the most at Vaga. When the guns are raised to salute separation, division, rupture, when the neighbor dies and wears the shroud, becomes enemy all at once, my friend, you go away only as a bird does, flying in the free skies. When lines of hatred rise against prayer flags, Vaga happens. And I love you the most because you are on the other side of the border. So my theatre is over, and when I say theatre, I really don't mean that. In that sense, I think all of us are all the time acting, engaging in theatre. But genuine theatre comes to be theatre only when the poetry in you comes out spontaneously through action also. So it's actually going into the art of living when we talk about that, not in any prescribed fashion at all. Do we entertain any question and answer? I think maybe two?
Maybe, but we have a roundtable discussion scheduled as well. Can we have it? We can have it. Okay. Yeah, we can have some questions.
Yes, anyone? Okay.
You can ask Rakesh. Meanwhile, if somebody feels like, they can.
Okay.
I got two questions. So one question is to Professor Patra. Sir, when you were talking about Pauli Carl Jung conjecture, and we have learned about the kind of possibilities that they were trying to explore between the inner world of psyche and the outer world of physics. And here Carl Jung introduces the theory of synchronicity, right? Where there are some kind of symbolic, there are some kind of coincidences, but they are symbolic but they are not causally related, and that leads us into the domain of quantum mechanics, where there is none local and none kind of causality. So this kind of conjecture, how you are thinking the different pathways that you try to disrupt in the field of creativity, literature and Indian intellectual traditions, how this theory of synchronicity could help us in navigating. That is my question. And my one small question to ma'am. Ma'am, when you were talking about silence, and silence being the vertical line in our spine, and we see in some of the texts of Indian knowledge traditions like Yoga Tattva Upanishad and Yoga Kundalini Upanishad, talk about Sushma Nari, the Nari between Ira Nari and Pingla Nari, and the place where action and the actor finally subsumes into a state of sakshi or silence. So when J. Krishnamurti introduced that it changes from, he talks about choiceless awareness, silence, and it is needed to be changed into constructive action, the poetry into action that he talks about. Then which part of literature, like which kind of silence from the theories of literature you'd like to introduce that would facilitate this change from choiceless awareness to societal action? Thank you.
Thank you. Very difficult question. But yeah, I will say that very recently one interesting work is happening where this whole new concept of time through synchronicity is coming. I can give you the references. It's mainly by some of our own works, but others also, like Nicholas Gissin, someone, and is a very veteran quantum physicist. So he has proposed that a new concept of time can come out from this. So you see that earlier, if I go back to classical physics, there was no creative time. There was no concept of creative time. Interestingly, earlier to Newton, the idea of space-time was different. So if you, in West I'm talking about, so in Europe, if you go back to Aristotle, the space was defined in a different way. Space was relational. So if you have these two bodies together, then space is based on the relation between these two bodies. It is not a passive platform. Now that was totally transformed by Newton. So Newton thought that space and time is absolute and it is passive. It is just a stage on which drama unfolds. Now quantum physics has further challenged that. And that is coming through this concept of synchronicity. So in quantum information theory, for example, whenever you do a particular observation, and here observation is again quote unquote, so it is interactions, basically any kind of interaction. So whenever that interaction happens, genuinely new information is created. So it is not like that everything is determined and therefore there is no necessary, that all events are necessary. Here events are beyond necessary. There can be something which is beyond necessary. And that is where creativity comes in. And I think that now the main point I would like to mention is that it is not about quantum physics only. That is the main point. What philosophers are trying to understand nowadays is that it is more genuine feature of the world as a whole. It is more genuine feature of cosmos as a whole. Nothing only physics. So these principles of synchronicity, creativity, emergent, contextual emergence, these are more genuine and general principles, and that is where our own research comes in. And that is why we get some inspiration from quantum information theory or information theory in general, and they try to relate to mind and that thing. So I think yes, that is happening, that is already happening. And another point is that we need to go beyond the idea of physical space-time. So physical space-time is not the creation of this universe. One is that in cosmology itself there is a lot of debate about so-called Big Bang theory. So there are many perspectives. Even James Webb telescope is showing us many things which can debate, which can be skeptical of that. And as our chair mentioned very rightly, that silence and nothingness, That is utmost important. Without that, nothing happens. And in quantum physics also, there is something called as quantum vacuum. Now, quantum vacuum is full of creativity because all creativity comes from that vacuum. So I think that, but main point is that these are more general features, nothing to only do with quantum physics. These are more general features. Thank you.
I want to add something here, which is that I think a related area that might interest you, I'm going by the questions you asked, is memory studies. If you look at memory studies and you look at the way time is looked at over there, you might find some answers to the questions that you
I will say that memory study and quantum-like framework, they're deeply related. There are many works happening in that.
Absolutely.
First, I think, we can wait. Okay, we can have your question and ma'am can begin with Rakesh's answer and then maybe hers. Yes.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful session to all the panelists. My question is to Professor Sudeep Patra. Now, since you are looking in your research, since you are looking at the dialogue between Western quantum physics and Indian philosophy, especially with regards to the binaries, right? And you're looking at Jainism, right? So it's just an observation that could you also in the future maybe work upon other dimensions. For instance, in quantum physics, there's this one branch also that says that observation influences the other person's behavior, right? If you're observing something, it influences that person or that thing that we are observing, right? And if we go into Indian spirituality, into Kundalini, Jagran and the energies that we feel, Indian spirituality says the same thing. And once we are into meditation, we reach a certain state where we can actually feel how the other person's energies are influencing us. We can catch, we can detect the exact kind of energy that we are catching from the observer. So, could you also look at the confluence between the two?
Okay, just.
My question is, science has a certain methodology, and subjects like religion and what was just being talked about, Anekantavad. See, these are very intuitive perceptions that come directly through a guru and through Shaktipat and many other. It's a whole ecosystem. It doesn't happen that your Kundalini is rising and coming down. It doesn't happen that way. Nor do the texts say that. So these are very different methodologies of maybe touching the same subject. So how do you, as a scientist, resolve those? This is my question. Very simple.
Okay. I first get back to that point, then I try to reflect on that. Yes, going back to this observer effect, there has been a lot of literature in quantum physics. It goes back to, first of all, to John Neumann. So John Neumann was a mathematical prodigy, etc. So Neumann thought that, there is a very famous problem in quantum physics known as measurement problem. So measurement problem is still unresolved. There are so many interpretations. So ultimately we don't even know what is a measurement. So ultimately someone can say measurement means just interaction. So Neumann thought that, if you really want to explain that, you have to bring in consciousness. You cannot do it without consciousness. So maybe consciousness is something which is beyond quantum physics and it has some kind of effect of collapsing the so-called wave function and so on. That is one view. Then later on, Eugene Wigner, another scientist, he further extended on that. And but our point, I think that if we try to take some insight from Indian philosophies, is much more than that. So there is no divide between, this Cartesian divide between consciousness and matter and duality. And there comes perhaps a more deeper view of that. So it is at least more relational to my mind. So you see that a new view in quantum mechanics has come up with this relational quantum mechanics that has been deeply influenced by Buddhist thinking, codependent arising and so on. And there you have truth, which is contextual. I mean, not talking about Brahman, but truth, facts, which are contextual. And contextual means relational. So here you have both observer and the observed taken as a whole. You cannot really segregate one from the other. And that was also the point of Niels Bohr, but now it is coming back. So that is one point. And then going back to different methods, I think that it is very deep, this question. Now, the work that I am doing with Professor Partha Ghosh, that mainly relies on the logic structure. So logic structure means that it is a kind of like a mathematical exposition of the Anekantavada logic, and then trying to see that whether that can give insights for understanding quantum theory or cognitive science in a better way. So that is still in the intellectual domain, but then certainly realization is something which transcends that. So yeah, that is a different issue, but at least I will say that this work can be taken as a kind of beginning, that to go into that.
I just want to add a bit of trivia, and I want to take from what Sukrita ma'am said about the fact, and you've reiterated that, the fact that we don't separate so much. In my college days, we used to have something called scansion. So we were taught scansion, which is a meter in poetry. So really, are we escaping science ever? I thought I had escaped maths for the rest of my life when I finished my class 10 exams. But when I got back to college, I was doing maths all over again, but in the most creative way possible. So really, I beg to differ from anybody who says that, the scientific temper is separate. I mean, it's been seen sometimes like that as a binary, but it isn't.
I think this actually requires a whole seminar, because I think this is a debate which sometimes we get entangled in jargon which we don't fully decode. We haven't decoded it. So we need to decode what quantum physics is actually really saying and what you are saying. With you, there would be a lot of complexity coming along with it. But when we are asking questions, that complexity is not taken cognizance of, which is not fair to the subject. It's not fair to the subject. Similarly, in the context of the Indian, or rather this entire world, way of thinking, East and West, I think first of all we have to develop a dialogue of understanding. And that comes after, several seminars of this kind happen. And so I would say that we can probably wind up here. And in terms of answering your question, I have forgotten, which has something to say about memory studies and quantum physics coming together. It has evaporated. All I can say is, word is sacred. We know that. In every language, word is sacred. You use it to get rid of it. Thank you.